My name is John Pfeffer, and I'm the Director of Foreign Policy and Focus and the Global Just Transition Programs at the Institute for Policy Studies in Washington, D.C. And we are a think tank based in Washington. We do a lot of work both on domestic and international issues. And over the last summer, we had a series on kind of the rise of the far right, or the re-rise of the far right, the continuing rise of the far right around the world, with folks talking about the far right in Latin America, in Europe. I did a session on Hungary and Poland. And we weren't able to fit Russia in at that time, but we are very fortunately able to discuss the topic today. And I'm joined by two wonderful scholars on this issue. And I'm going to introduce them now and then also put their short bios in the chat for you to have. And I'll also provide a couple of links to IPS programs as well. Alina Parker is a full-time lecturer teaching in the writing program and in the Russian, Eurasian, and Polish Studies program at the University of Massachusetts in Amherst. She studied in Kharkiv and also spent time in Moscow doing research. Arseniy Kumankov taught at Moscow School of Social and Economic Sciences and HSE University from 2013 to 2022. He's also authored dozens of papers in both Russian and English, along with 3 books in Russian: War in the 21st Century, War in Thrall to Violence, and Modern Classics of Just War Theory. And he told me before we started that he's continuing to look at this question of how war is represented in textbooks, both in the Soviet and Russian era. He is currently in Germany at the University of Mainz, and he also, of course, studied in Moscow. So we're going to start with Alina, and she's going to talk for a short period of time, and then we'll go to Arseniy, and then we'll turn to questions. So, Alina, I'm going to pass it on to you.
Hello, and thank you for the attention of the people who have come to listen to us and for your attention to this topic. I started studying the Russian right about 10 years ago when I was writing my dissertation. My dissertation was about a history museum, a kind of a very large memory project that was initiated by Orthodox monarchists in Russia, and so grew over the years into this huge chain of museums, and also became a kind of a hub for different types of Russian patriots, which is a kind of term that they prefer. They would not necessarily call themselves the right, but they see themselves as the true patriots of Russia, and this kind of label unites different kinds of political actors, including monarchists, different types of nationalists, Stalinists, who will have very different ideologies, but all support the idea that Russia should be a great power of some sort, a kind of empire that dominates the region and is ruled with a strong hand. And since 2022, I started studying the so-called Z Telegram, which you may have heard about, which is this kind of new online hub for the pro-war activism, these kind of patriotic activists in Russia. And this kind of patriotic community has transformed because now it has this kind of practical goal of winning the war or supporting the war effort. And sort of the people who have coalesced around this online online platform are military bloggers, military volunteers, combatants, artists who celebrate the war, different political ideologists, propagandists who work more kind of directly for the Kremlin, and through their writing, through fundraising activities, and through activities more directly focused on manufacturing things, such as gear, military gear, drones, medical kits, camouflage nets, etc. They contribute to the war effort in some significant ways. At the same time, because there are a fairly large number of kind of ideologically motivated actors within this community, and because sort of by engaging in these activities that I have mentioned, they have sort of started turning into a kind of a civil society in a weird way, like civil, uncivil society. And this sort of changes the kind of the nature, I guess, of this community, because while it is infiltrated by the government, soaked through with government propaganda and ideology, and controlled by security services, at the same time, it also has a lot more kind of grassroots activity and initiative than in a lot of other areas of public life in Russia. And so I'll speak from that perspective, because this is sort of what I am studying. And before we get to more specific questions that I think John will ask, I just want to say one thing about the kind of the Russian right is that it is important to kind of keep in mind that there is no structured political field. In Russia, there are no clear political ideologies. There is no organized right. And especially kind of at this grassroots level, because the Kremlin might be trying to build some kind of a more consistent ideology at this point, because it is necessary to continue the war and continue this foreign policy. But at this kind of bottom level, it is really a lot of fragmentation and confusion. And in general, kind of Russian public life is dominated by the Kremlin. And so this political field is sort of bent by the Kremlin as a kind of a force field. And so when something is said in the public space in Russia, it is shaped by this force field, which can be the fear of Kremlin, the need to cater to the authorities, they need to maybe gain some public funding to, maybe promote your organizations or initiatives, and sometimes maybe motivated by direct commissions from the Kremlin, right? And so when we talk about kind of the right-wing activists or forces, one thing that we have to pay attention to is, are they independent kind of actors? Are they moved by some kind of goals of their kind of organizations or initiatives? Or is this something that is kind of more of a puppet project? And sometimes it is hard to tell.
Excellent. Thank you, Alina. So we're going to pass it on to Arseniy, and then if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A, and we will get to them after Arseniy gives his short statement. Arseniy, over to you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for organizing this event. I must say that the Russian rights, or the Russian far rights, have come to my life rather late. Well, still they have come. So it's quite interesting for me to participate, and I really appreciate this opportunity. So I think from what Alina has already said, it's clear now, and maybe this is not a great. I mean, maybe it's rather obvious that there is no integrity in Russian wing groups, in Russian rights wing groups. There are many different groups, so much so that many support the war in Ukraine, and some of them, as again Alina has just said, looks like they are baked by Kremlin, when some may seem to be rather independent. But at the same time, I must say that while some of them are really supporting the war, there are other groups that are protesting against the war, or even fighting against Russia as part of the Ukrainian military. So there is a real spectrum. And of course, the invasion of Ukraine in 2022, maybe even early in 2014, has been a serious issue, a game changer. But at the same time, of course, right-wingers have existed in Russia throughout the entire post-Soviet period. And I think that the peak of their popularity is considered to be in late 1990s, so in the aughs, so like post-Soviet period and early Putin's era. And then throughout the 2010s, various groups were created. Some of them gained popularity, but then many of them were banned, or their leaders were persecuted. And then we had a so-called conflict in eastern Ukraine, where again, many of these groups joined the conflict when Russian officials kept telling everyone that Russia has nothing to do with the conflict in Ukraine. And then, of course, in 2022, there was a full-scale invasion, and it was clear that Russia is doing something in Ukraine. And again, there was another wave of interest from the Russian rights to this war. And maybe there were a lot of expectations from this right specter of Russian activism or Russian politics, that the war could help them to be could help him to gain more legitimacy, could help them to become more visible and to play more role in Russian politics. And so there were a lot of hopes, maybe even hopes that the Russian conservatives or Russian right-wing forces will finally turn into a new elite in Russia. But in reality, what happened is that even if some of right-wing figures did gain a certain amount of power or legitimacy or resources, those who have long been integrated into the power system in Russia before the war are the ones who benefited most, not this radical, not integrated in political system rights, like ideologically right part of the Russian spectrum, but rather those who can repeat some right narratives and who have gained some political position, government position before the war. So and this is probably the most interesting part of this of my research, is that there are not only those who are traditionally considered as far right activists or politics, but rather these integrated into Russian political system persons, such as usually they are the leaders of different, as it's usually called in Russian. Well, in Russian it's called siloviki, so meaning like representatives of different force ministers, like the head of the police, the head of the military, and the head of the Russian investigative committee, or maybe the head of the federal security service, like FSB. So they maybe it's also Patriarch Kirill, the leader of the Russian Orthodox Church, who could sometimes sound very rightist or very imperialistic. It's also some other figures, and more specifically, I'm trying to see how this rights agenda is represented and is produced within the framework of educational system in Russia, specifically in schooling system in Russia. So I will probably stop here with this introduction, and we can discuss then.
Excellent.
What have been presented already. Thank you.
Excellent. That's wonderful. So I'm going to remind folks that we have a Q&A function. So if you have questions, please put them in there. And if you have comments, you can put them in the chat. And I'm going to begin with a couple of questions of my own. The first question really is about, the typology of the far right in Russia. And Arseniy, of course, you've made an important distinction between the right that is embedded in Russian institutions, in the Sloviki and the power ministries, the intelligence agencies, and then the kind of disorganized right, if you will, outside of the power structures. And Alina, you in some sense have given us a view of those disorganized, uncivil society activists. And the first question is, Alina, you've written about kind of the strange political spectrum of the far right, that there are folks who are associate themselves with rebuilding the kind of Soviet grandeur. I mean, they're almost like a Stalinist far right, if you will. And then folks who consider themselves monarchists, I mean, kind of traditional right wing in a more European sense, who would like to see, it's some kind of form of traditional right wing political structures established in Russia, which may or may not overlap with Putin. And so my first question for you, Alina, is can you give us a little bit more detail about the range of political ideologies along the spectrum? And then following that, Arseniy, can you give us a little bit more sense of what right wing means inside the government, inside the Putin administration? What does it mean? Does it have an ideological flavor, or is it purely instrumental? In other words, they're embedded in the structure, they've attained a certain amount of power, and they want more power regardless of ideology. So those two questions, and let's start with Alina.
Yeah, so this community of patriotic actors, who I would still label together as the far right, because of sort of their support for authoritarianism, their support for kind of aggressive imperial wars like the Russian-Ukrainian war, for their shared across the board kind of racist, xenophobic views that they hold. But when you look at this diversity of actors from sort of the insider perspective, they see themselves as very divided. And they see this division as being along the line of left and right. So there is a kind of a weird paradoxical left within this far right. And this left is influenced by Soviet ideas, and some of these ideas are really opposite in many ways to the right-wing ideas, because Soviet Union promoted internationalist kind of ideology, not nationalist. It was sort of building a kind of a Soviet community of denationalized people, mixing different ethnicities, meanwhile promoting different ethnicities and building these national republics, thinking that they will be kind of these temporary entities, but at the same time kind of remixing people within the Soviet Union. And this feature of the Soviet Union is really abhorred and hated by Russian nationalists and monarchists as well, because they think that the Soviets, the Bolsheviks, they have really undermined the Russian ethnicity. They destroyed the Russian culture, they destroyed the Russian church, and this cannot be forgiven to them. And the church and religion is one huge kind of difference. And while the kind of the descendants, these post-Soviet descendants of Soviet ideologies have embraced the church and religion, but they're still seen as suspicious by their opponents within this kind of patriotic field. And they are seen as people diluting, as like diluting the kind of the correct religious dogma and the pure, Russian pre-revolutionary Russian culture, etc. And the other huge disagreement and difference between them is the ideas of the correct economic order, because obviously the kind of Soviet version of equality that the current, as we could call them, Reds, within these red patriots, this idea of economic equality also contradicts the kind of pre-revolutionary order, right? It's like how things should be. There should be the estates, and so there should be a kind of idea that those who have earned their wealth, they should have their wealth. Like the government should not come and just take from you what belongs to you rightfully. And and so these monarchists and and other kind of forces that are more kind of properly right wing, like they support capitalism, they support market economy, they have no problem with that. And then they also disagree on foreign policy, and they disagree on the ideas of who should be included in kind of the group of Russians. And so even with this war that they're leading in Ukraine, and a lot of these people actually participating very actively as volunteers, as some as combatants, they disagree on kind of how they see Ukrainians. Are Ukrainians Russian? Are they like fully, properly Russian? Are the people in the Russian army who are fighting in this war like Chechens, for example, or other ethnicities within Russia, are they Russian? Like how Russian are they? Should they be really included in kind of this idea of Russianness? And what should we do if kind of we win this war? Like what is the idea of the kind of the future foreign policy? Like are we with the global South, do we kind of pick up the Soviet mission of kind of uniting the global South, and reconstructing the former Soviet bloc? Or are we with kind of Europe that hopefully will also shift in the same direction, and it will go back sort of to its roots, and and so all of these differences make it impossible for them. And then they have different heroes. They have different ideas about certain historical events. For example, they might even disagree on the importance of the Great Patriotic War, which for the government is a huge important symbol. But some of the monarchists, for example, think that it was just a waste of like Russian resources, unnecessary bloodshed. Stalin was a criminal and not a hero, all of these things. And so there are these kind of sets of ideas, but if you look at the actual patriotic camp, there is no clear division and separation. It's not that there are two camps. But instead, there are kind of groups and actors and initiatives that are more ideologically charged. And for them, these ideologies are more important and they're ready to fight for them. They think it is important to actually like clean up this kind of patriotic community of the opposing ideology. And then there are people who think that we should find some kind of a compromise or we should reject both, maybe, which is harder to do when basically your consciousness of who we are and what we're doing is shaped by these kind of opposing forces and ideas. And so there is a lot of kind of infighting, and often there's just the desire to kind of go beyond and overcome all of this, and a lot of people are participating in this war for kind of for other reasons, because they just the circumstances, the personal networks have brought them, to the army or into the volunteering efforts, etc. And but this is still sort of the shape of this community.
Excellent, thank you. So I hear that this rather amorphous far right is divided by at least four different elements: by ethnicity, views on ethnicity, views on religion, views on class, views on geopolitics. At least those four, if not more. I'm sure there are other dividing lines, but as you said, there can be overlap among these as well. So it's not so easily distinguished. We had a question before I turn it over to Arseniy, a question in the chat. And there is a request to name some of the groups, so we'll get to that as well. But this question of whether there is an independent kind of movement of the far right, and I think, Alina, you've identified some of the internal reasons why it's difficult to have a unified movement. But of course, there's also the question of the power of the state, of Putinism, and the government not wanting there to be any independent challenge to the authority of Putin. And of course, we have some key far-right leaders who've been arrested and thrown in jail, like Igor Strelkov, the famous, that's his nom de guerre, of course, but a blogger, someone who participated in the Ukrainian operations early on, but who fell afoul of the Putin administration by being too critical. And so there are limits to the far-right movement and how they can both organize and articulate their positions. But maybe, Arseniy, you can address this as well in your answer to my question about the kind of what the ideology of the far right embedded in the Russian government looks like.
Yeah. So long story short, I think Alina has already answered that there is no ideology. There is nothing like a real one big group or movement taking this right or far right positions in Russia. And maybe it's not very specific to Russia only, but rather we may say that probably the times of ideologies have gone, and maybe it's something that people used to have in the past, in the 19th or 20th century. So yeah, there's Bradley's question, and I think we will address it later. But if we can try to compare the situation we can observe in Russia and, let's say, in Italy or in Germany 100 years ago, it's just a complete difference. And those movements, well, first of all, they were real movements, and they had ideology before they came to power, right? And this is not what we are seeing in Russia now. And still, I think that there are, as I have said, there are some integrated into Russian politics persons who may have these pieces of right ideology, or at least who can sound as they are right, or even sometimes far right, when they are saying something like that Russia must be a country of Russians, and that we must protect some specific interest of the Russian people inside Russia. And of course, Russia is multi-people state, but after all, it were Russians who have played the most significant role in building contemporary Russia, or building the Russian Empire or the Soviet Union. So, do they have ideology? I think that they have these elements or pieces of ideology. They have, or maybe there are different sets of ideology they can borrow and use. So probably pinch of nostalgia to Soviet Union or to the Russian Empire, depending on what type of the Russian rights you are analyzing. As Alina said, there are Stalinists, but there are monarchists, and they are, of course, different, but usually they would tell you a story about golden age that Russia as a Russian Empire had, or Russia as the Soviet Union had. And then it was ruined. I think what unites them is also is that they are statists or entities, so they can take different positions in terms of their sympathy to Stalin or to Russian emperors. But they would say that it's really important. Well, of course, it's important to have some good life for Russian for the Russian people. But what's even more important is that there is a very stable, very strong state. Not democratic, not necessarily democratic, not liberal, not legal, not social one, but precisely like a strong state. Would it be an empire? Would it be a national state? It's another question. But if we are looking for something, for some like ideological trends that could be recognized in this right or far right sector, I would say that there is probably only one thing that unites them, and it is this belief in a strong state, that's Russia. So, in case of, as I have said, that I'm more interested in more and researching more Russian educational sphere, it would mean that in schooling kids, you will hear that a good citizen or a good person is a person that serves to their country. And in the end, it would mean that you cannot be even named a real person, like a man or a woman, if you're not serving to your country. So this is like a total dedication to this thing. Yeah, what else? Talking about the goals of those who are in power and who are using these right narratives. I don't think that they may imagine themselves to get some better position. Well, at least some of them are at the top of the, let's say, of the police ministry or at the top of the secret service. So you are already at the top of it, and still you have well, this is probably their real worldview, maybe not real ideology, but rather worldview. So I don't think that they, at least that all of them are using these right narratives in order to gain more power. but rather they are just saying what they really think, and they sharing their views on Russia, on the way the world is organized.
Excellent. Thank you. Um, there was a question in the chat from Laura asking about kind of the names of some of these far right groups. So, Alina, maybe you could address that. And meanwhile, I'll throw out another question there, and that is kind of the relationship between all of these groups, both inside the state structures and outside in this amorphous, uncivil society, what their relationship is with Putin. And, you know, in many ways, all of the things you've described, both you, Alina, and you, Arseniy, all the kind of attributes, ideological attributes, could apply to Putin as well. I mean, obviously, he desires a strong state. He appeals to a golden age. And that golden age can go back to, you know, even the time of Prince Vladimir. I mean, it's a long period of golden age potentially. He certainly believes, as you point out in the school textbooks, that you're only a citizen to the extent that you serve the state. It's an illiberal state. But he also manages, it seems, to straddle the categories of monarchist and, or say, red and brown, the categories of red and brown, of kind of Stalinist and monarchist, by seemingly appealing to those who have a nostalgia for the Soviet Union. And we've seen the more Stalin statues erected throughout Russia these days than there have been in the post-Soviet past. But also, you know, clearly not putting himself entirely in the camp of reconstituting a Soviet Union and rebuilding a communist party. So he seems to be able to appeal to all sides of the far right, in many ways like Donald Trump was a kind of compromise figure in the United States, between those who were just kind of conservative and those who were far right. He was someone who was palatable to both sides of the broad conservative spectrum. So I'm throwing that question out there, but first, Alina, maybe if you could identify some of the groups on the far right.
Yeah, so so I can identify a few groups, but the thing is, and I don't know if this is a known fact or not, almost nobody can register an organization in Russia. And even those groups that have existed, unless, you know, this organization was promoted by the Kremlin, then it's very easy to register this organization. But even some of these more independent groups that have existed for decades, they are unofficial and they do not have like an actual organization. And so, for example, you may have heard of Eduard Limonov, who started the National Bolshevik Party in the 1990s, and then he had another organization, Другая Россия, but basically it's sort of the same group of people with the same kind of ideologies and goals that just has to reinvent itself because it's banned as an extremist organization, and they are not allowed to do anything in any public spaces, etc. And so, so Limonov is dead, and his people are still around, and they would still be called mostly National Bolsheviks, and mostly they exist as a series of Telegram channels where they talk about the issues that are important to them. They have, I think, some military units in the war zone that represent them, and they have other actors with like who may be more integrated into the kind of state institutional networks, but with kind of some sympathy and interest in their causes. One of them is Zakhar Prilepin, who is kind of like one of those people who sort of close to the state, but also sometimes can be critical of the state and want to reform at least like the cultural sector. He is a pretty well-known author who who in 2011, 2012 participated in anti-government protests, but after the Crimean annexation has fully kind of joined the government causes and supposedly like fought in Donbass in 20 not in 2014-15 but later supposedly was a commander of a military unit etc. And he's a former National Bolshevik, for example, and he has a whole series of his own initiatives, like his volunteer headquarters, and he is connected to one of these military units, and he is fundraising and supporting, and like clearly some government money flows through him. So it's really confusing kind of to look at this because it's unclear like who is connected with whom and are they against or for, so this is kind of in part an answer to your question, like how do these people feel about Putin? Sometimes you follow a kind of a line of connections that comes from the government, like clearly, like for example, Zakhar Prilepin's organization received a huge government grant at some point, right? But then, like if you follow his this chain of connections that leads from him, you can come to the people who are very anti-government. But there is no break in this chain at the same time. Um, uh, and there are other kind of red left-wing organizations that support the war, and some of them used to be against the war. And then at some point, their leadership changes. For example, another rather well-known actor, Sergei Udaltsov, who also participated in anti-government protests, then served, I think, 3 years in prison, and then returned and now, kind of reorganized the Left Front, this organization, to support the war and to like, you know, contribute to the war effort, etc. So and there are a lot of left wing. So one thing that I'm trying to say is that there's the role of personality of a specific leader, of specific person who can organize other people around themselves is more important than institutions, because institutions I'm impossible to register, impossible to keep up. The government constantly tries to sort of dissolve all these institutions that have any independence. And so it's easier to name people than actual like groups or initiatives. And plus, like ideologies are confusing, right? And so there are a lot of different kind of disparate actors and little groups kind of like that on the left around specific people. And then on the right, there is like a pretty well-known political entrepreneur, Konstantin Malafeyev, who contributed to the annexation of Crimea and the invasion of Donbass in 2014, 2015. He is an Orthodox monarchist. He also contributed to this memory project that I studied earlier, Russia, My History. So he funds a lot of these projects, and he also has this large kind of chain-like organization, the Double-Headed Eagle, the goal of which is to restore monarchy in Russia. And so, and there are a lot of other kind of actors and organizations and military units and some kind of militia forces in different cities around, and all of that is like funded by him. And he owns a television channel, an online television channel that was actually modeled on Fox News. And they worked with some people at Fox, like kind of trying to emulate their models. That's called Tsargrad. But at the same time, on the right, even among the monarchists, there are other actors who have different views. So there's a younger generation monarchists, and they don't really have an organization. It's just a series of different Telegram channels and maybe not YouTube channels, but some kind of a video streaming blogs, and they might have somewhat different views, and they read Western kind of, for example, Curtis Yarvin, has kind of come to the public attention at the beginning of last year. So these people have read Curtis Yarvin, for example, and they liked this idea of kind of contemporary monarchism, digital monarchism, kind of corporate style monarchism. And so they don't like sort of this traditional orthodox, traditional values, sort of ideas that come from the older monarchies, but they have a different idea. And then there are neo-Nazis. And again, it's easier to name the specific kind of battalions, neo-Nazi battalions fighting in Ukraine. Like there's one called Deshirge Rusic, another one's called Española. And the people who represent these battalions, they're also public speakers. They talk about their ideologies, and they have some kind of influence. And then, there are others that are maybe harder to kind of place along this ideological spectrum. But like you mentioned, Igor Strelkov, for example, there are a lot of people who support him. And so it's sort of not an organization, but a kind of a network.
Excellent. That's very helpful. And if we have time, it would be great if you could come back to tell us whatever happened to the Liberal Democratic Party and Vladimir Zhirinovsky, who was big in the 90s, but of course he died a couple of years ago. And they still, I think, are in the Duma. And then Alexander Dugin and his relationship to the far right. And you bringing up Curtis Yarvin, that'll be my last question, which will be, what's the relationship between the Russian far right and folks outside of Russia, especially far right movements here in the United States and in Europe? Is there much beyond, say, reading each other's materials in translation? Is there any actual organizing that goes on between the two camps? But first, let me turn to Arseniy, who can answer any of those questions, but also the question of the relationship between the far-right movements and Putin, and this kind of tension between the Kremlin project and what the far-right wants to achieve.
Yeah, this is, of course, a great question. I mean, I'm asking myself, and usually when I'm reading about Russian far rights and far right somewhere outside of Russia, in Europe or in the United States, or when I'm reading about authoritarian regimes or democratic backsliding, I have this feeling that they're basically reading the same books, or they are there specific like summer schools for authoritarian or far right leaders. At the same time, I can claim, and I don't want to speculate about that because this is not, I feel I don't research this specifically, whether there are like global cooperation of the far right or authoritarian leaders or dictators. And I would probably try to address a couple of questions that we have in chat, and also that have been raised in the previous discussion. So I think it's important to answer to the first Bradley's question about is there no independent organized far right because they are all absorbed into the regime. I think that the answer is no, and I think we should take into account that in Russia, in the last 35 years, we have had, like roughly saying every 5 years, we have had a new generation of rights organizations, a new generation of rights leaders, right activists. And it was easy for them to organize their activity in the 1990s. But since very early Putin's era, they were brought under very thorough control. And in 2002, in Russia, there appeared an anti-extremist law after actually huge riots that happened during a soccer game that was broadcasted in the center of Moscow. So there were riots like in 30, 50 meters, 50 yards from the Kremlin. So people were burning cars, fighting each other, and so on. And right after that, it was presented like, okay, we have this huge problem with football hooliganism or with right extremists. Of course, let's have an anti-extremist law. So it's sometimes considered as if the whole riot was a provocation. Okay, and so after that, it wasn't easy for the Russian right to hold their activities, and some of them, but still there were a lot of people who tried to do something. And Alina has already told us that in the last, I don't know, 10, 15 years, it's almost impossible to register your organization if it's not somehow supported by or approved by the president's administration. So I can't say that all of them are absorbed into the regime, but rather most of them have been repressed, or some of them tried to use these spheres of uncertainty, gray zones that have appeared after the beginning of the military conflict in Ukraine in 2014. So Alina mentioned the Battalion Española, but the leader of Española, what's his name? Dmitry. I don't remember his name. So his nickname is Hispanец, like the Spaniard. His real surname is Orlov, the Spaniard. So anyway, I think that his case is like revealing, he's telling us a lot, because he was the leader of this group since 2014. And then like a couple of months ago, he has been killed under very strange circumstances. So he quarreled both with another Russian right leader, with so-called Orthodox oligarch Konstantin Malafeyev, who has already been mentioned by Alina too, and with the president's administration. And then a special military unit came to his country house, and he was killed. So he tried to use this situation, and of course, after 2022, he gained some power, but in the end, he wasn't absorbed by the regime, but rather regime annihilated him, as well as many other rights or military leaders. So it's not. I think that the regime doesn't really need these people, and the regime sees them as dangerous, as unpredictable, maybe too passionate sometimes. Maybe the regime sees that it's not really possible to control them, so the regime uses them, and after that, they may be just banned or sent to prison, or really killed. And there is also a question about Dugin. Will we take this one?
Sure, go ahead.
Okay, I think that Dugin is another, also like a very telling and revealing person. He has been struggling for power. He has been struggling for being named as Vladimir Putin's most favorite philosopher, or maybe the brain of Vladimir Putin. I think this is not true, and of course he's holding some privileged position coming from a university sphere. He's running sort of a think tank or an institution, but still his influence is very limited. If there is an ideology in Russia, if there is like some regime's view on the politics, it's not baked by Dugin. While of course sometimes Dugin and Putin, or Dugin and some other Russian officials may sound similar. That still doesn't. So his influence is rather limited.
Excellent, thank you. We are coming up on 1 p.m., which is kind of our limit for these lunchtime seminars,
Yeah.
but I want to give Alina a chance to answer some of those uh, lingering questions about kind of the foreign relationships between far right in Russia and outside of Russia, and perhaps figures like Dugin and Zhirinovsky.
Huh. Yeah, and I also realized that I never like, answered the question about the relationship of these people to Putin, and Arseniy talked about it to some extent. Um, so about these international connections, so there are some forces that have been working with sort of their counterparts in Europe, like Malafeyev's networks, for example, have established connections to the far right in Europe, like to Marine Le Pen and to other organizations like that. They have even had some kind of congresses organized in Russia before the full-scale invasion. And there was definitely this exchange of ideas, etc. So these like younger monarchists, they read these kind of more out of the box far right philosophers, etc. But all of that is happening in the context of extreme anti-Westernism. And so all these borrowings and exchanges are limited, especially at the moment. And even this kind of new, warmer relationship between Russia and the US this past year, it's taken with a lot of skepticism by these actors. And yeah, so I would say they are more isolated than connected at this point. Meanwhile, their relationship with the state is also extremely complicated because, on the one hand, like Arseniy was saying, like the rhetoric of the Kremlin and a lot of these philosophers may sound similar, and it's possible that Kremlin is borrowing from them. And the Kremlin needs sort of their help with the war effort and their volunteering effort and this fundraising and manufacturing, all of these things, they come handy. But basically, um, as soon as the war comes to some kind of a close or pause and they are less needed at the moment, most likely they will be repressed in some ways, like the head of Española or like Strelkov, who became too dangerous, or others.
Excellent. Thank you. And you wrapped up just at 1 o'clock, so I appreciate the attention to our timing. I want to thank you both for really helping identify the trends, the people, the movements in this very complex, amorphous, uncivil society of the far right and its, the portion of it that's been absorbed into the Kremlin elite. And for those of you who have been viewing, I'd like to thank you for coming out and hearing us. We'll make a recording of this available on the website and send it out to folks as well.